excited to have Professor Philip Torr as our next keynote speaker. Professor Philip Torr did his PhD or DPhil at the Robotics Research Group of the University of Oxford under Professor David Murray of the Active Vision Group. He worked for another 3 years as a research fellow and still maintains close contact as a visiting fellow there. He left Oxford.
Oh, you don't need to read it all. I'll just introduce myself if you like.
No, this is great because it has, after you left Oxford, you worked as a research scientist for Microsoft Research, first in Redmond and then in the Vision Technology Group, and ultimately returned to Oxford as a full professor where he established the Torr Vision Group. He won several awards, including the Marr Prize, which is the highest honor in vision in 1998. There's about 100 different awards, just remarkable that Phil has done through his research at the university, and also a number of significant spin-outs and startups that he has been a founder and advisor of. And Phil was elected to the Royal Academy of Engineering in 2019, a fellow of the Royal Society in 2021 for contributions to computer vision, and in 2021 notably was made a Turing AI world-leading research fellow. Let's give Phil a warm introduction.
Okay, great. So it's funny hearing these introductions because you just realize that life passes like that. And it's just, 1 minute you're like a fresh-faced undergraduate, and the next minute, you're kind of in your prime. So I don't know whether this works. Okay, that's great. So I thought I'd zoom out and think, things have moved incredibly quickly in our time. And, what's the world going to look like if we carry on at this rate in 100 years? And it's an important question for all of us because it's going to affect, I haven't got children, but it'll affect your children. And I think actually we're at this really interesting thing. ChatGPT was only maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Look how much the world has changed. And I think the next big wave that's coming, which I'll talk about, is agentic AI, which I'm working on quite profusely. And what I'm going to lead you on in this talk is a little thought experiment on just the possibilities that might arise and actually why we need to think about them now to make our best possible future. So I'm going to look at 2 propositions, both of which I think will come true. So I think there's a lot of hype around AGI, and of course, big tech companies like OpenAI will say, it's going to be next year, but let's imagine it's going to be in 100 years. I think within 100 years, we'll have something, at least to some definition of AGI, we'll have something like that where machines will be able to do jobs that, we as humans do at the moment. And I think also, another big impetus for change is going to be the rise of robotics. So we're already seeing, this one here, the Unitree, for about 20K, which is not too bad, right? If you think about somebody's wages for a year. So at some point as well, we're going to have very capable agentic systems, and we're also going to have capable robots that will be able to do that, do the jobs that humans do. And so, there's a lot of talk that in the next maybe few years, we might see that billion-dollar company with just one person. How many years that is, we're not quite sure, but I actually think one thing to imagine is it doesn't really matter. Sure, there's a lot of hype around AI, but I've worked in it for about 30 years and just seen the rate of acceleration. And one thing for me that I can definitely say is it happens much quicker than I've expected. The rate of progress has been much, much quicker than I'd expected. When I started as my PhD, I would have not envisioned. I kind of, was into Asimov and thought we're going to be having robots at some point, but I hadn't really thought that it would possibly be within my lifetime, depending on, I ride a motorbike, so it might not be that long, we don't know, or definitely within my students' lifetime. So we need to think about this. This is kind of important. And I've had a lot of experience doing spin-outs and And as they said, I'll talk a little bit about those because they relate to what I'm going to say later. So, yeah, I run a group which, so actually I remember seeing Jeff Hinton speak in the 80s and being super inspired. I got to meet him and, I was really fired up by neural networks. And actually Lionel Tarasenko, who spoke earlier, I applied to him for a PhD to do neural networks. But apparently he tells me, I can't remember this because I was a bit of a party animal at the time. He tells me I turned up on the wrong day. And so I missed out having a PhD with him. I mean, he said there was a new lecturer who had started, who was doing computer vision, and maybe neural networks would be useful someday. And, of course, in fact, with ImageNet and all of these things, computer vision turned out to be the proving ground of neural networks. So eventually I got to work on, really what I wanted to do. Yeah, we started off as a computer vision group and then come round full circle, and now we work on things like, I got really moved to work on AI safety, mostly because, as agents and systems in the world get deployed into the world, I'm less worried about existential risk, but more about just how do we make these things safely deployable. And I'll talk a little bit about existential risk and what I really am worried about in the rest of this talk. So now also, a big new frontier that we work on is AI for science. So we've got a big collaboration with Novo Nordisk. I've just launching a new spin out on green material discovery. So it's actually a really exciting time to actually be in machine learning. The phone never stops ringing. And actually, I'm now started to work with a bunch of economists. So, when I was a kid, has anybody heard of the Foundation novels by Asimov? Yeah, so, I got really inspired by this. And now, it's a real pleasure to be working with some top economists on trying to model society and actually make predictions about the future and reason about causality and make agent-based models. So that's kind of interesting as well. Now, just winding back from this heady mixture. So in 2016, I got contacted by a guy called Stan Boland. Initially, I was going to ignore the email. Then I found out he was had been CEO of Arm, which was really exciting. He said, Phil, I want to set up an autonomous car company in the UK. That was 5AI, and we actually ran the first autonomous taxi service in London, which was going really great. And that's actually when it really made me think about safety because, you don't want to kill anybody. Not A, for the moral reason, B, because it will kill your company. And, it really came into my mind that if you're deploying this sort of 1 or 2 tons of metal, you really need to think about putting safety up and center. And so what happened was actually the lockdown came. And so we had to do everything virtually. We pivoted to safety and to assurance for cars. And Bosch acquired that. So also, commercially, safety is important. I've got another company now, which is called Agent, who are working on basically AI agents, which can do things like, book your travel holidays or all sorts of things, really. And we have a big open source platform where we're releasing code in an open source community. And the reason I was talking about that is because, the future of the economy will be agentic in some form. Now, let's look back. It's only 2 or 3 years since we had ChatGPT. And this was kind of like, with Galileo, he said, give me a big enough lever and I can, move the moon. And I think language models came about by this happy confluence of having cheap GPUs developed by games, the internet, and huge amounts of data. And, we've already made huge progress. But now what's going to happen is we have a huge investment, which will be a bit slower in the development cycle, but still will be there. I mean, actually, one analogy I make is if you think about aeroplanes, it took quite a while for us to get to aeroplanes. There was a big period where, planes were taking off and crashing and, people weren't really progressing very fast. We have to think of AI a bit like that. So there's always this hype and then a bit of a crash, but eventually we're going to get to the jumbo jet. And at the same time, robots are going to be developed, which will be able to be as capable as us. And we'll also have agents able to do all sorts of things on the agentic economy. So as I say, I think the one-person billion-dollar company is possible, and actually it will be driven by the deployment of robots and also the deployment of agents. So when ChatGPT was initially trained, it was on what I'd call static data. So it's a bit like you get your child, if you have a child, and you tie it to a chair, and then you only allow it to watch TV. It can't interact with the world. And then you have another child who can interact with the world. So it can have conversations with you and get feedback on those conversations. When it's a deployed robot, it can look at you, see the subtle changes of your expression. So this, as these things become deployed in the world, the type of data that's being acquired, and it's already happening now because we're interacting with these things, will actually be even better, and I think will allow another quantum leap of performance. So we have to be expecting this. And, people talk a lot about AGI. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? I think probably even 100 years, but it doesn't matter because you think about the timescale of humanity and how long humans have been here. That's a small amount to have such a huge technological change. And at that point, we won't have ever had on our planet something as capable as us to be able to solve problems or do things. I'm working with Novo Nordisk. There's lots of people. AI is going to be dreaming up, new drugs, hopefully some fun ones, which, people haven't even thought about. There's going to be, I've already launched a spin out, which is going to be discovering new materials. I'm working with American healthcare providers, looking at your longitudinal patient records to understand those and predict what illnesses you have. So, and also what sort of treatments you'll be allowed under your scheme. And all of these things, actually, even though they sound like diverse applications, the core technology is largely similar. And so this is why I think we're going to be getting to this general AGI. And it will design products. As I say, the reason I mentioned economies is because AIs will even be able to run your companies. They'll be able to have predictive models of the economies, probably as good as humans. We're already seeing these things called super forecasters, which can actually predict the future better than humans. We'll have assistants and accountants and doctors. Also, education, which is a super important thing that we talked about there before because we need to educate people. There's going to be a lot of job losses and changes. And then imagine we do get to a point where we've got a humanoid robot that can pretty much do anything that a human can. Well, what's going to happen? I mean, we could work less. So apparently in the Middle Ages, people only work 10 to 15 hours or something on average. Technology has always in the past made new jobs. So, we might have the light bulb let us work later. The car let us drive further to work and commute a bit more. So, maybe we'll have, like a whole new set of, fulfilling jobs like data labeling or something like this. But, what actually seems to be happening in the trend is instead, imagine, we have is anybody here from Tesla? Okay, that's great. So all the other tech companies are great, because I work with them all, but I don't work with Elon. And so imagine now we have Elon Musk, makes the robots, makes these agents, puts everyone out of work. He dies, his son takes over, he has all the wealth. And then we have this huge, what do we do with everyone else? Where do they get their money? How do they live? What do we do? And that's why I say, once we do this thought experiment, even if it's 100 years in the future, we need to think about actually what happens in this. Actually, in this very room, Nigel Shadbolt arranged a meeting of all the sort of permanent undersecretaries of the government. And they were worried about this. They were red teaming, like what's going to happen to society if there's huge unemployment? And we're already seeing a polarization of society and people, getting very angry at each other. And we've seen in 30s Germany, if you have mass unemployment, people unhappy, this can lead to very bad consequences for society. AI will run key infrastructure as well. So power network, transport system, even our taxation system. Robots, and this also speaks to the point of, at some point, of the things that Lionel was saying, because these things will be so critical, we might actually not want, you can imagine AI becoming almost a national resource where there's a central brain running a lot of things in the country. You probably don't want it controlled by foreign powers. You probably want the expertise. So, actually, I was talking to Cassidy earlier. What does sovereign AI mean? Well, one thing that's really important is it means having the expertise within your country that if these things go wrong, presuming we haven't got fully automated and AI is fixing them, that we have people who are living here, who have that expertise invested in this country to be able to do these things. And what it means is resilience. So if a foreign power decides to put some sort of tariff or trade war with us, which limits our access to key aspects of the AI supply chain, we need to be resilient to that, because that, as we see from the past year, this could easily happen. So we need to start thinking now, within each country, what would happen if things were switched off? Because there may be a war, there may be a conflict, all sorts of things could happen, and it will become so essential to our economies that we need to start forward planning these things and making a taxation system and an environment that encourages, say, the businesses in the UK, or your own particular countries. So that would be sovereign AI. We have to be super worried about the concentration of power. So I'm going to ask, this is going to be a really hard thought experiment. So imagine now that certain companies on AI get super rich and they can pay for politicians or use their social media to help a politician get in. And they can potentially put hundreds of millions into a particular politician. Then imagine the politician gets in, he gives advantages to that company, and you end up in this sort of, cozy cycle, which could subvert democracy. So how do we avoid ending up in a hereditary oligarchy? Again, these are things that we need to just think about to make sure that there isn't an over-concentration of power. And also, if these organizations fund the research on, AI in universities, this could also be a bit like tobacco companies funding research on cancer. So you have to, I'm not saying anybody's evil in this case, but I think that power corrupts. And if you centralize power too much, it will corrupt whoever is involved, no matter. It's a bit like Lord of the Rings, none of them can put the ring on because it will corrupt them, and because it gives them ultimate power. And that's kind of the same with AI. And it's going to get worse, because at some point we're going to have huge mass surveillance systems linked to all of your actions, combined with robotic armies. We're already seeing the rise of drones. I can imagine fully autonomous weapon systems within the next 10 years. This means that if only one or two people have control of that, they could also immediately subvert society and take control. Imagine drones just controlling you and putting curfews on you. Not saying this will happen, but again, when I'm doing these thought experiments, these are the things that I'd like to talk about to make sure they don't happen. And also, we have to stop AI imperialism, in the sense that if you are dependent on a foreign power for all your media, for all your essential goods, you pretty much lose sovereignty. So, you'll be under the sway of that foreign power. So we have to, I would actually say, we have to think about how do we encourage these. And this isn't anybody's fault. It's because, Milton Friedman, very interesting, read his stuff. He said the only duty of a company is to make profits for its shareholders. So companies don't have a moral value to support democracy. They don't have any, and they shouldn't do. This is the way capitalism works. But with AI, we might have to think about, and sometimes to think about writing an article about this, but we have to think, there's been a succession, Marx looks at succession of economics models, and we might have to think about a new economic model, because supposing now we have super AIs designing the products, robots doing all the work. So initially, capitalism was, there's a famous Adam Smith, it's not for the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own self-interest. But that's broken if robots and AIs are doing all the work and everybody else is sitting around. Now we don't need that incentive system. So how do we move beyond that, and how do we think about it? So I don't have the answers. These are just thought experiments, but I'm going to maybe throw some few things out. So one idea that people talked about was democratization of AI, open source. And I'm a big fan of open source. I've got another talk about its pros and cons. I won't go into that now, but it doesn't really solve the problem, because if people control all the robots and all of these things, you might have the source code, but if you've got nothing to run it on, then it's not going to be that useful. I think, we have to be very aware about monopoly. So monopoly, if you end up with a few big players, who can acquire anything that's coming up, then we're ending up in a potential monopoly situation, especially the big players going to everything else. So I think that at the moment, we really need to think about how we prevent just one or two, and it's kind of what's happened at the moment, but one or two players maybe controlling the whole market, because that's bad for innovation. This is the short term. I think the US is kind of interesting. So Trump actually has kind of indicated at least one solution. God bless him, love him or hate him. It's kind of interesting that, for instance, he has said that TikTok must be US owned because he doesn't want a foreign social media company influencing his population. Now, that's a very interesting statement, right? Could that apply to other countries, for instance? And also, his idea is that tariffs and also certain rules could ring fence his own country to help them develop their own economies. Well, maybe actually that could also be similar if people had the initiative. Perhaps that's how everyone can develop their sovereign capabilities, by actually trying to think, how can we make a taxation or other type of system to encourage our own homegrown businesses? So just kind of an interesting direction. And I think this is also super important. So Jeff Hinton was a mentor of mine at Microsoft. And one of the things that he talked about, other than strapping babies into chairs, was mass persuasion, which was, like AI will become very good at manipulating people. I'm nearly finished. Imagine now you've got a bunch of swing voters, you've got your social media, you can just push the buttons. Maybe you show them pictures of, things that they really hate and they get enraged and they vote a certain way. So, this combination of control of media together with AI could be very dangerous for democracy. And again, I'm a big fan of freedom of speech, but that freedom of speech should probably be the right of your own citizens. And there's also a thing of editorial control. So if you're being shown things on social media, this is not just freedom of speech. You're being targeted with particular things, sometimes misinformation. So, do we actually want that? Is that good for vulnerable people, for children? These are things to think about. Again, Dutch government's just taken control of Chinese owned chip maker, Nexperia, again. EU needs to wake up a bit. They're kind of they're not thinking about this. Okay, I've got 5 minutes, so I'll go quickly. One idea is that maybe later on, companies, there are certain companies that are treated as utilities, which have different rules under law. So you might say that some things become a basic right, like your right to have water, your right to have electricity. So again, you could treat some of these services as utilities, one thought. You could nationalize it, but there are problems then because it becomes too much like, under the sway of potentially politicians, which might not be desirable. There are independent organizations like the BBC who actually have a charter and a governance and a sort of decentralization of power, which might also, be a model for how we could, run some of the companies that become national resources. Similar organizations as well. I think one thing that's kind of interesting is at the moment we kind of run in an elected dictatorship, which was kind of designed in the 1800s or 1700s. Actually, we have the internet now, and we have the ability, we have AIs that can solicit people's opinions. So one thing that I think is really good to avoid this, which is the anathema of what I'm talking about, is rather than concentration of power, why don't we start to decentralize power? And the Athenians had these collective democracies where they could share, more of the decision-making within some sort of constitution. Taiwan was very interesting. So Audrey Tang, she actually enacted this thing where, the AIs could actually get everyone's opinion and try to aggregate them. And you could actually have a more direct democracy through the internet to actually, give people's opinions on what's going on. And decentralized control. So Polis is a real-time system for gathering and analyzing what's happening in large groups. Very interesting initiative. And I think the other thing that's super important that government or independent organization is education, because people need to be, I think that obviously not here, but general populace needs to be educated about all of these things. So learning critical thinking, especially with such amount of misinformation online, learning how to come to decisions. This is super important for our democracy, because only by having a very savvy, and so AGI helper for everyone, and got the white flag there, but so overall, I should say, despite this talk, I'm still very optimistic. I think I didn't want to depress you, but I think I just want to raise awareness of these things for people to think about, and then it might. Nobody can predict the future. I can't. So, but I think it's good to think about worst case scenarios just to steer us in the right direction. Thank you very much.